I am coming up on 2 years of owning the Giant Anthem 27.5, and if you've seen my other videos, I've said this is the best cross-country bike I have ever ridden. I absolutely love this bike, and I am going to go ahead and change out this frame for the 2016. Now, I go with the aluminum frame, and I run carbon wheels, the Stan's Valor wheels, which I will say have increased the fun factor of this bike by 2. It's just amazing how good these wheels are. So to save a little money, and also because I like Fox shocks, I go with the aluminum frame because the carbon one comes with a rock shocks. I'm partial to Fox, so I run the carbon wheels. And so what I'm going to do is I'm changing out the frame, but I'm going to do something that I've been very curious about for a while. And judging from some of the comments that I've gotten on my YouTube channel, I know a lot of you out there are also curious to know, how does a 120 millimeter fork ride on the Giant Anthem? So it's going to be kind of like the Anthem SX. I'm not going to have a dropper post or anything like that. It's going to be the exact same bike, but I'm going to change out the fork for the 120. Now, the reason I'm doing that, I think that I'm probably going to go with the 100 fork because you can space that one back down to 100. But 2 reasons I'm getting the 120. One is because I'm curious and I want to let you guys know what I think about the 120 on this bike. But also I want to have the flexibility. So all you do is you change out the air spring cartridge. It's probably a 30 to 45 minute procedure to put it at 100. And the fork is pretty much the same weight as the 100. It's like 10 grams heavier, so really not much difference. So I'll get the fork in. I've already got the frame. Let me show you the frame. So here is the medium Giant Anthem aluminum frame, 2016 model, and it's a really sweet black. Part of it's matte, part of it's shiny. Most of it's a matte black. The logo and everything is kind of the shinier black, so it's a really good looking frame. Again, Fox shock, so really good looking frame. It does come standard as the 142 by 12, so that's really cool. And by the way, I did weigh this frame just a few minutes ago, and it's 5.7 pounds with the shock, so really nothing else installed. They do have the head cups already installed. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and transfer all the components and the current 100 fork onto this bike, because it's still a few more days before I get the 120 fork in, and I'm gonna just ride it for a few days, and then once that 120 fork comes in, it's a pretty quick procedure just to change it out, and then I'm gonna go for a ride and immediately give my feedback, because the first impression is usually the one that's going to be the most accurate to judge the ride qualities. Again, the Anthem 27.5 is such a balanced bike. And I really think I'm going to go with the 100 just because it's so agile, so snappy with the 100 millimeter fork. But we'll see. Maybe I'll love the 120 and not get the spacer. I am going to go ahead and get the air spring cartridge. I ordered it with the fork. It's like 35 bucks. And you can get a cartridge to make it a 110 or go ahead and make it a 100. It's a separate cartridge. So I got the 100 cartridge with it. And if I don't like the 120 as much as the 100, if I think it slackens out the geometry a little bit too much, then I'll go ahead and put the 100 or put it to 100. So it's one of those things I just got to know. I got to know how the 120 feels because I have a trance. So if I didn't have the trance, I'd probably keep it at 120 because it makes the bike a little bit more versatile if you're riding in the mountains. But since I have a trance, I like to keep this bike really cross country. And again, when I hop off my trance and I get back on the Anthem, it's just this bike handles so well. I just can't tell you. It's so fun to ride, and it's just, you get a lot of control with the smaller wheels. It just accelerates really well. So I'm gonna go ahead and change out the components, and I'll show you the bike before I get going on it for my ride. Alright, so I've transferred all the components over to this new frame. So again, like I said, I'm doing my current fork, and when the 120 comes in, I'll swap it over. But I want to get in a couple days of riding on the bike, so the only thing that will be different will be the 120 fork instead of the 100. And what I'm going to do, by the way, is you can see how many spacers I run underneath. And I keep a lot of spacers when I cut a steer tube just so I have flexibility. But what I'll do is this big spacer, I'm going to move up top. So I'll drop the stem down a little bit to kind of keep the bars in the same position, so I won't feel like I'm sitting up too high with the 120 fork. And I may even put the stem all the way down and just maybe cut the steer tube a little bit shorter for the 120. But I don't want to go too much, because if I go back to 100, I need to have some spacers. But again, everything's exactly the same, and I will report back once I get the 120 fork. I want to show it on the video, and then I'll go for a ride and let y'all know what I think about the 120. So today I got the 120 fork in, time to get it installed. Let me mention one thing that I didn't mention before, and that is the only negative characteristic that I can say about the Anthem 27.5 is that it's prone to some pedal strikes. So it's kind of a trade-off. The bottom bracket's lower, your center of gravity is a little bit lower, which makes the bike handle awesome, but the trade-off is some more pedal strikes. It's not too bad. I did have one that was pretty nasty, but it was on a rock that I may have hit, whether or not the bottom bracket was high or not. So putting the 120 fork on is actually going to raise the bottom bracket a little bit. So I'm hoping that it will eliminate or reduce those pedal strikes, but not affect the handling too much and slow it down too much. But we'll see. I want to show one thing. This is the air spring assembly that I bought. It's a $35 part, and this is what I can use to reduce the 120 back to 100, because like I said, the 120 is the same price and the same weight, almost the same weight. It's like 10 grams heavier than the 100, but having this gives you a lot of flexibility, because I can reduce the travel. Just a matter of dropping the lowers, taking out the retaining ring at the bottom, and putting this in, putting everything back together, and put some oil back in the fork. So I can do that. Now what's also nice is that Fox includes these volume adjusters, and you can pull off the air cap out of the top, add or remove some of these volume adjusters, and this will change the air spring rate. The 120 uses one of these, and the 100 uses two. So if I do go down to 100, if I want to keep the air spring rate the same, I would add another one so that I have two inside the fork. At least that's what they tell me on the website. And so that will keep the spring rate the same. Or if I want more volume, want a little bit more plush fork, then I may just not put the other one in there. So now let me put this on the bike, and I'll show what it looks like before I get out and ride. So I just want to show you the bike before I talk about it. This is the bike with the 120 fork on. And I just want to hold up the 100 fork, and you can see there's just not, let me back up a little bit, not that much of a difference. I mean, it's amazing, and you'll hear me talk about this when I talk about the ride quality, but I'm holding the seals so they're next to each other. You can see just, it's not that much of a difference, but it does make a difference in the ride quality. So I've already done a ride on it, and like I said in the beginning of the video, my first impression I think is going to be the most accurate, and it's going to probably give my best comparison, because I've been riding the 100 fork, and I rode today for a while on the 120, and I've got some thoughts that I want to give you, and the difference is pretty noticeable. So now let's talk about it. Okay, so as with most changes that you make with an adjustment on a bike, there's good and negative. It seems to be there's always a trade-off. You know, whether you're going bigger tires, smaller tires, or whatever. The fork is no different. And these are some notes that I made when I did my ride today. First of all, let's talk about the negatives of the 120. The steering feels a little floppy, especially at slower speed. So what I mean by that is, it feels like the bars can just kind of just flop into a corner, and so it takes some getting used to. If you go back and forth with trail and cross-country bikes, it won't be that big of a deal, but the thing is, I was so used to the 100 on this bike that the 120, the negative characteristics were pretty obvious when I started riding it. Probably more so than when I jump on my trail bike, because when I jump on my trail bike, I kind of know what to expect. This, I was expecting the bike to handle like 100, but it handled differently. So the steering feels a little floppy. with the 120, and this is something that's, you know, fairly obvious, but the arc that you make, so when you make a turn, you're making an arc with the head angle steeper. So with the 100, and you know, the fork is lower and the head angle is steeper, you feel like that arc is just sharper. With the 120, the arc is bigger, and so it feels like sometimes with the 120 you just can't get the bike to corner as fast as you want to. I'm over dramatizing that, but that's really what it feels like. You need a little bit more real estate to make that arc when you're turning. So with the 100, you feel like, I call it slicing a corner. So you feel like you can just dive and slice right into the corner. With the 120, the longer fork, it feels like you're making more of an arc, more of a gradual arc. Again, that's a little bit over dramatizing, but that's what I feel like. I just feel like I can ride more aggressively with the 100 as far as the agility of the bike and just making it go from corner to corner on the real tight stuff. So talking about aggressive riding, also it feels more, the 100 feels more like a sport bike. If you're familiar with motorcycles, the 100 feels like the sport bike, just that super agile type handling, whereas the 120 is going to feel more like a sport tourer, where you're sitting a little bit higher up and you just don't feel like the bike's quite as nimble and agile as it would be with the 100. When I first got going and I really started to pick up my pace with the 120 today, there was one section I hit that was just a real sharp turn, and I threw the bike into the corner just like I would with the 100, and it almost washed out the front wheel because you know, I just threw it a little bit too hard for the head angle of the bike. So that's a good example of the aggressive riding. Another case, I almost hit a small tree. We have a lot of tight trails, and the trees are really close to the trail in a lot of instances. So, I mean, they're so close that a lot of times my Jersey will just kind of nick a tree sometimes, and you just get used to it. But with the 120, again, I was expecting the bike to handle a little bit more like 100 just mentally, because I was on that bike I've ridden for so long with 100. And with the 120, I almost hit a small tree because I just, you know, bike didn't quite turn quite as fast enough. So again, that's something that you would get used to. You would change your riding style a little bit, but I actually like the aggressive riding style where I'm just throwing the bike back and forth. So I would say that the 120 is going to feel, to me, it's less fun on the really tight, aggressive type trails that don't have a lot of downhills, because I'll talk about downhills in a minute, and that's where the 120 really comes in. But for trails that are just kind of rolling, tight, you're accelerating and jumping back and forth between corners, I feel like the 100 is more fun to ride. Now, here's where the 120 comes in, is if you want a bike that's more capable on descents, especially descents that are rocky or rooty, and you want a bike that's more stable. The bike is definitely more stable with the 120. And so when you're going over rough stuff, it doesn't feel like the terrain can throw the wheel around as much. You have a little bit more, I'd say, control, but more stability with the 120. So it's going to make for a bike that's definitely more capable on the downhills and probably a little bit faster on the downhills. And incidentally, speaking of being fast, I did a time section and I was a little bit slower today with the 120 than I usually am with the 100, just because that aggression couldn't quite be there. I had to be a little bit more cautious not to slide the front wheel out. Another reason is because we have a lot of leaves and pine straw on the trail right now. So anyway, the 120 is going to be better for descending. And so if you want your cross-country bike to feel a little bit more like a trail bike, then a 120 is a really good option. Because you still have a pretty light bike. In fact, it's just as light as it was with the 100. But it's gonna climb better. It's gonna be lighter. It's still going to be more agile than a full-blown trail bike with the 120. And so, again, if you want your cross-country bike to behave a little bit more like a trail bike, then the 120 would be the way to go. On the flip side, maybe you ride trail bikes and you want a cross-country bike, but you don't want to go full-blown cross-country, a 120 would be the way to go. So that leads me to where I think the Anthem SX for all of you Giant fans out there, people who ride either a Trance or an Anthem, I can see where the Anthem SX is a really good option for a lot of people. You don't want to go full-blown cross-country. Maybe it's your riding style, or maybe it's the terrain that you ride. Maybe you ride pretty rough terrain. You've got some longer, rougher descents that you still want to get up pretty fast. The Anthem SX is a really good option. So the Anthem with the 120 fork, it really does feel right between my Anthem with the 100 and my Trance. It's just right in the middle. Now, interestingly, the 120 makes the bike overall feel more plush. So even the rear end feels more plush with the 120 fork because those initial hits that you're taking with the front end are just softer with the 120, and that's why it's going to be more capable on the descents. So if you are building up a cross-country bike from the ground up, in other words, you get the frame and the components and all that, whether it's an Anthem or whatever, I would recommend doing what I did with this bike, and that is get the 120 fork, because I've said it a couple times, it's same price, same weight, except for a couple grams. And if you don't mind buying that air spring assembly for 35 bucks, and you don't mind taking the time to put it in if you want to reduce the travel, I think it just gives you a lot of flexibility down the road. So if I want to do an event where I want to use my Anthem, but I want longer travel, and I don't mind, taking that little extra time to just put in the different assembly to make it 120, because you probably know where I'm going with this, and that is I am going to reduce the travel back down to 100, because I do have a Trance, and I want my Anthem to feel really sharp and aggressive, and I want I've got my trail bike for doing the downhills. If I only had one bike and my trails were straighter and not quite as tight, 120, absolutely, that'd be the way to go. So, building up the bike from the ground up, I'd say get the 120 and reduce the travel if you need to. I do want to add that the 120 is probably the way to go if you're an endurance racer. So your events are longer, and comfort over the long haul is more of a priority than really just tight, aggressive riding. Then I would go with the 120 fork. One comment that I also want to throw in here is that using a shorter travel fork, so the 100 on the Anthem, is going to take more attention. You've got to be a little bit more on your game. You can slack off a little bit, be a little bit more lazy with a longer fork, and you can be a little bit more sloppy with your lines. With a steeper head angle and less travel on the front end, you've got to pay more attention. But the good thing about that is it hones your skills. It makes you a better rider. And so it helps me. So when I get on my Trance up in the mountains where the speeds really increase going down a downhill, I just feel like I can maneuver the bike a little bit better. And when you're going really fast downhill, even with a long travel fork, the bike is going to move around quick. It's going to be twitchy at high speeds compared to a slower speed. So using that shorter travel fork is actually going to hone my skills a little bit better. So when I get up in the mountains and ride, I'll be a little bit better rider. One thing that I learned from this is how dialed in mountain bike geometry is now. And it's amazing to me what just a little bit, 20 millimeters, it's not that much, but it makes a big difference in the way the bike handles. And so, the geometry of bikes is just so dialed. I think the Anthem in particular, I've said this before in my other videos, but it's a very balanced bike with the 100 on the front, 100 in the back. But throwing on the 120, it changes the characteristics of the bike a little bit, but it's still an awesome bike. And like I said before, the Anthem SX would be the way to go, especially if you only have one mountain bike. I think it's a good option. So that'll wrap it up for this video comparing a 100 millimeter travel fork to a 120 on a cross-country bike. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Thanks for watching.